Professor of Anthropology in the College of Social Sciences, Arts, and Humanities at FAMU. Bruce Strobel, PhD, is a distinguished sustainability advocate, anti-racism educator, and the Tallahassee community leader and founding member of Citizens for a Sustainable Future in the African American Local Election Review Team. We have Ms. Camille Lewis, educational specialist for the Lola Hampton Frank Pender Center for Agroecology. She's a Tallahassee native, local urban farmer, is an experienced educator and community advocate. Then we have Mutora Flood, who earned his doctoral degree in industrial organizational psychology. He's an assistant professor of psychology at Bethune-Cookman University and the 2023 recipient of 2 VCU Awards, Excellent in Teaching and Outstanding Service and Engagement. Got me on the time? Okay. All right. So I was asked to contextualize very briefly the panel itself, and its actual title is Frantz Fanon. Okay. Frantz Fanon and the Land Question: Consciousness in the Age of Climate Disruption. And in short, we want to explore what many would describe as the land question as it relates to African people in the age of the Anthropocene, which many Western historians, environmental historians, political ecologists, so forth and so on, are characterizing as a period in which human beings have altered our ecosystems in such a fundamental way. But we like to put this in the historical context of African people. So when we look at the multiple things that are happening around us in terms of climate disruption, whether it's famine and drought in Africa, hurricane, sea level rise, what happened in the Gulf, oil spills, black folk disproportionately impacted by climate change and other environmental concerns. We see they very much parallel other historical issues in our community: police violence, health disparities, economic inequality, the absence of political autonomy and disenfranchisement, failed states, all of this. But for whatever reason, we don't necessarily connect the two as one phenomenon. And for us, that's a question of consciousness. So we see what people are calling this period of the Anthropocene as an extension of Eurocentrism and modernization. They're essentially synonymous. What Carolyn Merchant has described as a quote-unquote ecological revolution, and not necessarily in a positive sense. So that is to say that the age of enlightenment, the quote-unquote age of revolutions, ushered in a period in human history where people radically changed their perception of nature. And this radical change of perception involved reshaping how we understood ourselves and how the world understood us. And these are some of the I think I'm looking up here like it's going to appear up here, but it's not. These are some of the implications of this ecological revolution. How am I doing to turn the crowd? Right? Where we begin to see, from a cultural perspective, this idea of advanced societies are more urban than they're rural. Where high levels of technological development and mass consumption become core features of developed societies, and societies that don't function essentially in an industrial capitalist context are considered underdeveloped and primitive and so forth and so on. Machines essentially become the measure of men, as you see in that title. And we see this very much synonymous and connected to the colonial experience, of which Frantz Fanon was a principal intellectual for our people in terms of interpreting that experience and helping us to understand it. And what the colonial experience was essentially shaped around in one of the most fundamental sense is the urban built environment. physical spaces to organize and institutionalize mass production and consumption, dependent on absorbing human energy and, I'm going to use the term, ecosystem energy from different places in the world to advance its quote-unquote development. And in that context, Black people, the African diaspora is absorbed into that loop. So in that context, Fanon would comment on some of these issues, and not all of them. The question of colonization, which he outlines in Wretched of the Earth. For a colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread and above all dignity. But then Fanon also gives to us a warning that all of us are familiar with, this idea of whatever we build post-Europe, post-colonization, post-Ma'afa, let us ensure that it's not an obscene caricature of Europe. That is, we don't attempt to repeat its human development goals, the way it organizes the society, assumptions around development in a general sense. But the question we want to address on the panel is, to what degree have we carried on that caricature? That distorted perception of reality, we would like to call it, following after Europe, either consciously or unconsciously. And typically when the land question is dealt with, and I'm gonna stop right here, when the land question is dealt with simply in the context, or typically within a strictly political and economic context. We want to expand that discussion, where we are simply concerned with gaining access to quote unquote what is rightfully ours, then imitating the technological and economic production patterns of Europe. And we want to consider that the seasoning and colonization process actually required what could be called a disarticulation of African socio-ecological formations. In other words, it deconstructed our identity as it relates to how African people see one another, how we organize our societies, but it also deconstructed and distorted how we see the environment and how we see our relationship to the environment. And now that's more critical than ever. So it's in that context that we want to continue this discussion, and I want to hand it over to Dr. Strobel. Thank you, brother.
All right, so what I'd like to speak about is climate colonialism, environmental racism, and the African diaspora. And what we're witnessing, as Dr. Disu shared, is that as a result of colonial practices and continued racial injustice, African people have been pushed into the front lines of what we're calling the climate crisis. But what we understand as the climate crisis is actually just the prolonged after effects of a long period of environmental degradation and the oppression of African people and other people of color across the planet. So I want to first unpack what actually we mean by environmental racism, just so that we're clear on this. We're talking systemic discrimination and environmental injustice, disproportionate impacts on communities of color, and this is where we see our people, African people here in the United States, whether they're in South America or back on in the motherland, they are exposed to higher levels of environmental hazards, pollution, and the climate change impacts are going to be right there, more intense than we're going to see in other locations. And this is due to discriminatory policies and practices, and of course the historical injustices, which we know starts with the European imperialism and colonialism into Africa. So this is a global issue. The climate crisis exacerbates these inequalities and threatens the health and well-being of African people, and climate change amplifies those impacts. And then that's why we see continued environmental racism, as it weakens the ability of African people to resist and to fight back. So, and that leads us to climate colonialism. So Fanon observed that colonial powers often viewed African people as objects rather than subjects, and as a result of this objectification, it would extend to land itself. And the land was therefore treated as a commodity and to only benefit the colonizers without any regard to the indigenous populations who are already there. We saw this in Africa, we saw this in Australia, we saw this in India, we saw this happen to the indigenous Americans. And if you see the screen here, this is from a recent survey just a few months ago in 2023, where they asked people across the Middle East and people across Africa, how do they feel climate change is impacting their day-to-day life? And you can see in most of the African countries, in fact, all the African countries surveyed, 88% of them responded to the survey saying that it affects them on a day-to-day basis. So while in the United States, in certain communities, people can still afford to have debates about whether climate change is happening or not. When we go to other places, there is no debate. They are having severe impacts on a day-to-day basis, and then this is coupled with recovery efforts that make the problems worse for our people and our brothers and sisters on the continent, so that European countries could start to mitigate their own climate effects. So, what does, when we think back about colonialism, what were some of the key aspects that really drove or drive climate change today? We're talking land dispossession, facilitated resource extraction, including mining, agricultural practices that strip land. These are not the traditional agricultural practices that Africans or indigenous Americans were using to feed their populations. These are extractive agricultural processes like mass growing of cotton, for example. Cotton strips nitrogen from soil, and then had it not been for George Washington Carver and other black thinkers, we would have had massive areas of just dead land. They had to find ways to regenerate the land. But when you have these massive agricultural practices that are extractive only, they normally cause a lot of ecological degradation. Resource exploitation as well, unsustainable resource extraction, continued deforestation, soil erosion, and habitat destruction. And of course, this is all followed with exploitative labor practices, and we know that whether it be indentured servitude or enslavement, or I guess you could say wage slavery, which they still practice in so many cases. So this is all followed by racial discrimination, which leads to mass displacement of African people, forced relocation, which we're seeing in several areas on the continent as well, and hazard siting. When there's environmental waste, what these corporations are now doing is they're taking the environmental waste and they're getting rid of it in communities of color. That happens right here in the United States, and it's happening in Africa as well. So just this, one thing that I thought would be important to share is that very often we think of, or people try to phrase climate change as a result of the modernization of the world, but it's not that simple. When we're talking about climate change, we're looking at a process in the continuum of colonialism. And what we see is that it starts with the colonial beginnings, where back in the 15th century, European countries began expanding across the world, taking control of the lands, resources, and eliminating indigenous populations. That then turns to colonialism by corporation. And we see the first wave of this in the 17th century, where companies like the East India Tea Company and others are transitioning from trade to territorial control, exploiting land and people for resources. And you're familiar with Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He goes into great detail about how these multinational corporations are exploiting Africans. And I think one of the great examples he used was how Goodyear and their extraction of the rubber, for example, made them more money than the actual countries they were extracting it from. So that's just one primary example of how these multinational corporations continue the process of colonialism. So that is followed by settler colonialism and resource exploitation. This allows the capitalist system to grow unchecked. That leads to supporting empire and global political economies that are continuing this process. And then that brings us our modern day multinational corporations. And this is what drives the current climate crisis. And then we see that followed with continued environmental racism, and then it brings us back to this point of climate colonialism. And this is where the actions proposed to mitigate climate change often require additional resource extraction. So for example, to get one of the big solutions that's being promoted for climate change is biofuels, to get clean fuel. Well, in order to do that, they are currently displacing people off land in Africa to put these fuel plants in. Same thing with with cobalt mining. This is necessary to build certain lithium batteries, certain long-lasting batteries, and solar panels as well, and they are mining that in Africa right now. So these are being purported as this is going to be our solution, but in actuality, it's causing more problems for African people. So, just some of the problems that we're seeing currently on the continent. We have a severe deforestation issue in the Amazon. So that's the Amazon, across the diaspora, I should say. Climate vulnerability in the Caribbean. And if you think of the recent string of hurricanes that we've seen very intensified over the past several years, they're hitting our Caribbean communities where we have a large portion of people of African descent. In Nigeria, oil pollution is a huge issue. You can see that in the top right picture there. Just in June, there was a shale pipeline that ruptured. It displaced hundreds of fishers. It ruined farmland, and people feel those impacts immediately. Now there's food shortages in certain areas as a result of this, and Shell has not been held accountable for this action. Electronic waste dumping in different parts of Africa is a significant issue in Ghana. You can see the picture here where the sister is there kind of highlighting the issue, and what's happening is that a lot of material waste is being sent to the continent, and it's causing all kind of environmental consequences for the people who live there. Land dispossession in Tanzania, I found this one really interesting. And very often there are African governments that are being coerced or in cahoots with European corporations. So here in Tanzania, what we're seeing is actually a Boston-based safari hunting big game corporation that is going there clearing certain areas to hold as preserves so that they can take people over there and do this high stakes hunting operations, but they are displacing certain indigenous groups in Tanzania in the process. So that's just one more example. Water scarcity in Cape Town. Certain corporations are buying up water as a resource, and then it's not allowing the people who live in the area to benefit from that as well. And then illegal logging, same thing you saw in the Amazon. We saw this in Sierra Leone as well, which I'll talk about in a moment, but it's also happening in Cameroon where their natural tree canopy and rainforest areas are being deforested massively for logging practices. So these are just some of the continued colonial practices that are happening on the continent across the diaspora that are driving climate change, as people are saying we need to address this issue. So my organization, Citizens for a Sustainable Future, who we're all members of, we took a trip recently to Sierra Leone, kind of on a fact-finding expedition, and we wanted to make some alliances with environmental organizations in Sierra Leone, and we just did some general environmental justice outreach and trying to develop some Pan-African partnerships, and we visited a fishing village in Funkia, Guru, Sierra Leone. And we came across some really disturbing circumstances that the people share with us. Ultimately, the pollution and inadequate waste management in the area is really obscene. You can see a picture here, and this is where the water is supposed to be coming in the shore, and it's just completely covered with trash. And a lot of that trash is being pushed ashore in the tide by the local fishing vessels. Now, this fishing village supported maybe had about 50 fishing boats there, and that fed anywhere, I think they say each boat was feeding anywhere to 50 to 40 community members as a result. But what they're experiencing is, first, as the temperatures are rising, it's causing the fish to have to go down deeper and out further to the ocean, so then they have to spend more money to purchase the supplies and oil so that they can get out deeper to do their fishing. When they get deeper to do fishing, they're getting into conflicts with commercial fishing vessels, which I learned a lot of them were Turkish companies and Chinese companies, and these companies are actually ramming their boats, using water cannons to destroy their vessels as well, and trying to push them back inward so that there's no competition. And they have not been able to effectively put up any kind of rights for their waterways or protect their water from these multinational corporations, and that is due, unfortunately, to corruption in some cases because of external pressures on their government. And then also there's some kind of issue where, and we weren't able to determine the cause of this, but they were telling us that as they get into the water, it's causing severe skin rashes that last anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. And they don't know what's causing it, but it's when they come in contact with the water. And this is the natural water that people are in every day in the Atlantic Ocean here, right? So there's going to have to be more research into that, and I'll be calling some health officials and making a complaint to people I know so that they can put pressure on the UN to address this issue, because it's a really serious issue and it needs to be understood what's going on there. But just people living in despair, just trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, and there are external factors that are making it harder for them. And that's just a prime example or a case study of how this neo-colonialism is still impacting people, African people. So that brings me to my final point, I want to talk about this process of ecological decolonization. And we had the pleasure of meeting one of the great minds of Sierra Leone, and this is Dr. Yunkele here. He is the Minister of Climate Change Mitigation in Sierra Leone. That's him in the center. You can see I have I borrowed his style. I got the same outfit that he has on now. I had to go get one made after I saw it because it was so fresh. But this is my team, and in sitting with him, he was explaining some ways that African people are looking to address the climate change issue. And they have some really great ideas, particularly they want to incentivize protecting their natural resources. And they believe that if Africa is going to preserve and not kind of go into, follow Europe into this concept of industrialization, but they're going to preserve their rainforest, for example, and it's going to be one of the major areas for carbon sequestration across the planet, then other countries should pay them to do so. Because they're capturing carbon that the rest of these countries are putting up, and they don't have to actually do that. They could start to cut that rainforest down and start to industrialize just like everyone else, but it will only further exacerbate the problem. So if everyone is not going to be doing what's necessary, that's one solution or one idea that they had, that we could start getting financial investment into Africa to maintain their rainforest. That's just one of the many solutions that he had. And this is kind of this idea of climate reparations. And that's going to take a lot of political push on this side to get the United States and other countries to start paying their fair share, as they are literally doing what some people are calling carbon colonialism, where all the carbon that is being exported here in the United States, in China and other European countries is ending up impacting people in the Caribbean, South America, and in Africa. So there's a unique role that Africa will play primarily because we are seeing our people on the front lines. They are suffering the most, although they contribute the least to the problem. And it's just something that we need to start making sure is at the front of our political discussions, cultural discussions, and education discussions. And that's really going to start with rethinking how we do organizations as African people, how we organize so that we're not simply replicating European oppressive models when we do so. And that is what my brother, Dr. Mutor Flood, is going to share with you.
Hotep, everybody.
Hotep.
All right. So I'm Dr. Mutor Flood. My field of expertise in psychology is industrial organizational psychology. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how African people organize and how that is different, and a lot of times the exact opposite of how European powers tend to organize, especially when they are over other people's lands. All right. What I want to get across, all right, about the European kind of mindset, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of very important people in the African Black psychology movement. But one is going to be Dr. Marimba Ali. Right? European people, all right, their cultural imperative, all right, is power and control, all right, and not power to do something. Everyone needs power to walk, to eat, to carry on life activities, but power and control over others. And that could be power and control over other people, over natural resources, over wildlife, over anything that is outside of the self of that particular individual, all right? And so if you look at how Europeans operate from that vantage point, a lot of things that they do tend to be clear and make more sense, all right? And what is happening is that a lot of African people, unfortunately due to socialization and a variety of other factors, are very confused about the European mindset. And so, I'm going to paraphrase again, another important brother, Nelly Fuller Jr. Right? If you don't understand racism, what it is, how it works, everything you think you know is only going to confuse you. All right? And so, with that being said, I'm going to get into some differences between the African worldview and mindset, all right, and the European worldview and mindset, and then how that connects as a through line for everything else that they do to other people in the world. All right. So let's continue. All right, so this is a schematic that I took from Dr. Cambone's legendary book on African Black psychology, but I think it's important to understand these differences. All right, so like I said earlier, the European worldview has a preeminence on the character of the group is control and mastery over nature. All right, African people have a harmony with nature. All right. We are not outside of nature. We are a part of nature, but that's not the mindset of European people, all right? A second is European predominance on the idea of survival of the fittest, all right? Hey, if I can dominate you and I can survive, however I survive or whatever I do to survive is a means to an end and is okay, all right? And whereas the African mindset is survival of the group. Right? That doesn't mean we minimalize individualism, but that not at the expense of the group itself. All right? And so the values and customs are going to be, there's an exclusiveness for European people. Hey, if I'm unique or different, even if that uniqueness and difference is something that is a negative to the group or the society, it's still seen as something that is beneficial and important. All right? Whereas African people have a more of a synthetic thought, all right, and more of an inclusive thought, all right? And then there's a predominance in the European mindset on individual rights, all right, and competition. Everything is to compete. And we know from lots of different studies that competing doesn't, kind of outcomes that come from competition aren't as good as the kinds of outcomes that come with collaboration, all right? And this is, soon to be Dr. Camille is going to talk more about that in the educational sphere, but we've known this for like 30, 40 years that competition doesn't work as well as collaboration, all right? And so there's a level of separateness, all right, and a predominance on materialism, all right? So if you can't, in the European mindset, if you can't see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, hear it, all right, it doesn't exist. And not only does it not exist, but it's also inferior. All right, it's inferior. And so that is almost diametrically oppositional to the African kind of worldview and mindset, all right? And then this kind of leads, all right, to other things that are more negative to other people in the world, such as oppression and aggression, all right? For a variety of factors that I won't go into today, the Europeans are one of the most oppressive and aggressive kind of cultural, ethnic, racial groups in the world, all right? And so then you have their preeminence on individualism. I talked about the uniqueness and differences, and all of those kind of factors, right, that psycho-behavioral factors, it kind of coalesces into racism, white supremacy, all right? And so they're gonna use that, and starting in the 14th century, right, when they were done fighting each other for the last 300, 400, 500 years, they started to use their technology and their hyper-aggression and barbarous nature to colonize the entire world, all right? And so let's talk about what that looks like in different forms. So there are a couple of different forms of the colonial forms of government, all right, for the Europeans over African lands. The first was direct rule. And so those were predominantly done by the Germans, all right? And this is just a naked aggression where you knew who was over you, all right, as far as who was controlling your land, who beat you in battle, and now they're just extracting resources from you, all right? And this applied to everywhere the Germans kind of ruled, and other European countries, but some classic places where this happened is in Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, etc., Togo, all right? And the Germans tended to select officials from the traditional aristocracy, all right, from the upper classes to rule over African lands that they had took through warfare, all right? Then you get indirect rule, all right? This is if you want, this is a little bit smarter of an idea, all right, on how to colonize and oppress people.
Devious.
All right, and this was mostly done by the British, all right? And so in this one, African societies were administered indirectly through the use of local rulers. All right? And so you get a little bit more of a buy-in when you use the population, all right, especially the aristocracy in the population, to do your bidding for you. All right? And so this happened in places like Nigeria, Uganda, Tanganyika, all right? And the status of the African chiefs were not the same, obviously, as the colonial officials. They still had higher rank, all right? But these African local rulers got a lot of perks from it. So their children would get levels of colonial education. These rulers got accommodations, paid salaries, were given protection, and the like. So it was beneficial only to a small kind of a group of people in these colonial countries. And then you have a little bit of a better idea, which didn't really work, but you have the assimilation policy. And that was basically used by the French, all right? And this policy aimed at trying to convince African people that they were just as French as the people in France, all right? And Dr. Fanon talked extensively about this kind of idea, about the people he was around would quote French scholars, try to speak French better than the French people, and really believe that they were French, all right, more than the people in France, all right? And so this is a better idea. However, it didn't really work that well, all right, psychologically. And so what the French then changed to is the fourth one, which is the association policy. And in that one, they gave African colonies had the right to elect local representatives to the French government, political parties, had a press and free trade, all right? And this policy was aimed at making colonies an integral part of Africa, all right? And so those are kind of the different forms of colonialism practiced by the European powers on Africa. And a lot of these, in different forms and fashions, are still being applied to Africa. Right? This hasn't left. There's a ton of African countries that still pay, quote, taxes for their liberation to European countries, all right, where rich people, rich corporations can get exclusive deals to extract resources from these African countries, where the regular population is living in poverty, and just a small percentage of families who have ties with the European powers live in extravagance, all right? And so let's talk about the different ways that those colonial forms and governments translate into how European people organize, and how that's different from African people. So I won't go through this fully, but the organizational style of Europeans, all right, is going to be large profits. They just want to extract as much profit as quickly as possible. They don't really care how they get those profits, as long as they're getting them. That's good for them. Their bottom line. All right. Whereas the Afrocentric or African organization has more of a support and care for the group. All right. The administrative policy for African people tends to be more of humanistic policies, where again the Eurocentric organization is based on the bottom line. All right. The power and authority in European kind of organizations is based on hierarchy. All right. They have more of a win-lose propositions when they engage in business affairs or organizing affairs, whereas I win and you lose, all right? All right? Whereas African people try to figure out a win-win kind of situation, something that's beneficial for both, so that one party doesn't feel like they've been taken advantage of, all right? The work orientation for European organizational ideas is a quantitative output. How much can you put out, all right, so that we can make profits off of you, all right, what you do, and extract as much labor time, resources, and the like from you. Where the work orientation of African people tends to be a sense of excellence. We're doing our thing in a beneficial way. All right, and so I'm going to run through some of these. Whereas if African people continue to use the organizational ideas of Europeans, we're always going to find ourselves in a disadvantage. And so if we look at this particular slide, it shows the traditional European American organizational form as a triangle. And then we show the European American or European culture as a triangle as well. And those have a perfect blend, right? Because they're one and the same, they come from the same source. But if we look at this from the vantage point of African people, well, we have the traditional European form of organizational design, and the African American culture is more relational and task oriented, and so there's no real blend to this, all right? It's dysfunctional, all right? But a lot of African businesses, African organizations, African groups, African governments still kind of take ideas from Europeans and apply it to how they organize. And that's why we're having a lot of issues in various different kinds of forms when it comes to African people. And so one of Frantz Fanon's psychological and psychiatric thoughts are that, again, I think Dr. Strobel kind of touched upon this. Members of the indigenous population are made to feel inferior if they do not conform to the cultural norms of the colonizers, so that they become dependent upon the colonizers for a sense of self-esteem, all right? But in his view, the object of therapy for the feelings of inferiority and despair caused by colonialism should not be to promote adaptation to the status quo, but to put the distressed person in a position to choose between passivity and action in response to colonial domination, all right? We shouldn't be trying to parrot European people, all right? We should go back, we should go back and find out what we did well, all right? Obviously not everything African people did was good, but we should find out what worked and use that, and then match that with what is happening now that would be beneficial to us, all right? And this is my last slide, and then I'm out, all right? And so here are some steps for changing an African organization, changing a Eurocentric kind of organization to an African-centered kind of organization. All right. First would come personal decolonization. All right. Everything starts in your own consciousness, in your mind. You got to stop that. All right. You got to find ways to undo what you've learned, what you've been socialized to do, to go to your natural self, who you are as an African. All right. And then it's adopting more of the African cultural values and an African-centered perspective. And then it's to use those perspectives and cultural values, all right, and indigenous knowledge and approaches to solve problems in your own world, in the African world, all right? And that's how I think we as African people should be moving on to. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning, Minapushe.
Morning.
My name is Dr. Nzinga Metzger, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the role of culture in the struggle for decolonization. So, for those of you who are familiar with theory and cultural anthropology, we have two major cultural anthropologists who've contributed to the definition of culture. One is E.B. Tyler, for whom a lot of cultural anthropologists rely on today. The problem with much of his theory is that he developed a theory that posited that cultures evolve on a linear time frame, so that you have this idea that cultures evolve from being less primitive, or more primitive to less primitive, which is completely untrue. And then we have Frantz Fanon, whose students among his students are people like Zora Neale Hurston and Melville Herstovitz. And he develops this concept of cultural relativism and asserts that culture should be studied as whole systems, and they should be studied relative only to themselves. So an inward-looking definition of culture. Then we have a definition of culture that differentiates between culture with a capital C and culture with a lowercase c. So culture with a capital C really is dealing with a definition of culture based on its elements. And I think for most of us, this is one of the places that kind of points at a problem that we have as a people, and I'm going to talk about shortly. This is actually, and I actually am trying to pull up an image that I should have posted on the slide, but forgot to do so. When we're thinking about culture, most of us think about, or let me ask you, what are the things that y'all think about when somebody says culture?
Music,
Music. Values. Oh, music,
clothing.
food, dance, right. So, dress, right. So one of the major issues that we have as African people when we're thinking about culture and we're talking about the cultural shift that Dr. Flood talked about is that we're not considering the unseen, less obvious aspects of culture. So, for example, we have things like patterns of group decision making. What does it mean to be a family member? What does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to be mobile? What does it mean? How do we relate to land? What does it mean to have a family? How do we define relationships? All of those things are a part of our culture. So when we're thinking about culture, most of the time what happens is that we get caught up in these external images or the tangible or the more observable aspects of culture instead of addressing what lies deep within under the surface. And then culture with a small c, we're looking at the elements that belong to a specific group of people. So what is a specific group of people's habits, norms, values, morals, etc. So one of the things that stands out to me about Fanon's work is the violence of the colonial enterprise. And what I think is most important when we're considering decolonization is the holistic nature of the violence that has occurred through the colonial enterprise. So we're not only talking about physical violence, but we're also talking about spiritual violence, we're talking about emotional and psychological violence, and we're talking about cultural violence. So the colonial enterprise attacks us at each and every one of those levels. It is a holistic, violent attack, and it's something that has been occurring 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And so what we have to do is remember that this leads to, among the colonized, distraction, because most of us then, if we are constantly being attacked from every angle, we're distracted with the task of survival. So this is what we see in a place like Sierra Leone, where every single day, people have no time to sit down and consider, oh, I wonder how colonization is affecting me. I wonder what my state of being is in this post-colonial state. They have to get up and get food. So they're completely distracted. They are psychologically and emotionally and spiritually disempowered. So when they look at the challenges that are facing them, they are faced with a sense of hopelessness, like there's nothing we can do. The only task that we can face and the only task that we can engage on a day-to-day basis is just stay alive. People become desensitized. So they look at what is happening around them. Some of the features that Dr. Struggle talked about at Funkia with the, I don't even know what word to use, the inundation of plastic that is in the water. You become desensitized to it because you feel that there's nothing that you can do about it. You have corruption that is contributing to the exploitation of your natural and human resources that contributes to this desensitization and a sense of powerlessness. And then you also have cultural erosion and invalidation, which is underpinning all of these related issues that are happening. And so when we're thinking about culture, and we're thinking about those deep structure aspects of culture and how those deep structure aspects of culture are affected, what it does is it knocks all the legs out from under people and it prevents them from being able to create solutions that are based on their own culture. And although colonization does attack culture, it attacks culture at a surface level, what it has been unable to do, and what we can look at for a sense of hope, is completely erode some of those deep structure elements. And this is one of the reasons why, as Dr. Flood was talking about, when we adopt European organizational strategies, when we adopt European approaches to life, land, work, relationships, why it doesn't work. because we have at a deep structural level our habits that are unspoken. We have a natural way of defining how we interact with each other. And then we come along and we overlay these European organizational structures, and there's a conflict. And then it leads to some of the dysfunction that we see in African countries with regard to government, and governing. With that being said, when we reverse the violence of the colonial enterprise and we start to address what has happened to culture, one of the first things that we have to do is begin to get to people at this deep structural level. At this point, I'd like to give you a personal anecdote. So a few years ago, I think this was in 2018 or 2019, I was in Nigeria, and I was working with a group of students. They were like 20 to 22 years old. And I was speaking to them about the importance of doing exactly what Dr. Flood said, which was looking at culture, looking at African culture for solutions. And one of the examples that I gave them was to look around at Lekki. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Lekki in Nigeria, but Lekki is a suburb of Lagos that was built on a swamp. So the swamp was actually dredged up, they created land, and then they built this supposedly, illustrious, high-class neighborhood on top of Lekki. The issue with Lekki is that every time there is a light shower of rain, it floods. It floods like crazy. And part of the reason why this happens is because there isn't proper drainage, and they've covered all of the earth with concrete. Not only have they covered the earth with concrete, they've also built all of these high-rise buildings, which over time are going to sink. It's a circular problem, right? Wow. And so I'm talking to these students and I'm saying, everybody wants to live in Lekki. It's cool to live in Lekki. It's desirable to live in Lekki because it puts out this image that you're living this Western advanced life. So my question to them was, don't y'all hate it when it floods? Because y'all can't go anywhere. I can promise you there is a ride from Lekki to where the airport is. It's supposed to be a 45-minute ride. One evening, because it was raining, it took me 4 hours. 4 hours to get from Lekki to the neighborhood where the airport is. And they were like, yeah, it's really inconvenient, blah, 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 blah. So my question to them was, what do you think the people who lived here 1,000 years ago did when it rained? Silence. And I asked them, do you not think that they had some reasonable approaches to managing nature and interacting and dealing with nature? Do you think that it makes sense to have the entire earth covered with concrete? Do you think that it makes sense to have a situation where people are living in concrete buildings that are, multi-story in a place that's hot and that has monsoons? And then you look down on your neighbors and your ancestors who cooked outside, but y'all are cooking on the inside of your house because you ain't got no electricity to run the AC. Doesn't make any sense. And so we continue to have this conversation, and at the end of the conversation, one of the young men says to me, so you mean that if Europeans had never come, we would still be advanced? That was his question to me. So when we talk about the importance of getting at the deep structure of culture and really getting people to understand what that is, and then revising our perspective on it, because deep culture hasn't disappeared. That's why when you go to different places around the world and you encounter African people, we have the same vibe. The deep structure hasn't disappeared. A large part of the problem is our opinion of and our ideas about African culture and the deep structure. So when we begin to revise that and we begin to teach young people and ourselves that African culture is worthy of consideration, worthy of revisiting, worthy of approaching and seeking solutions, then we can begin to really approach a phase of cultural rejuvenation where people can function in physical safety and wellness, which leads to them being emotionally and psychologically better. They have spiritual balance, and then they have respect for their culture, which can continue to provide them with solutions. So those are my 3 slides. Thanks.
Lewis, future Dr. Camille Lewis. I am matriculating slowly through my doctoral program. And I'm going to be talking about educating our children. So thinking about the issue of land and how we interact with the land. You know, we're all sitting at a university, so I don't think we can negate the power that education has to influence our decisions and influence how we relate to each other and influence how we think. So as the organization Citizens for a Sustainable Future took this journey to Sierra Leone, we were able to have discussions related around education and the impact education can play in fixing some of these problems that we've been speaking about up here. For example, the issue of land loss. There is a huge deforestation issue in Sierra Leone. They're cutting down forests to make firewood, they're cutting down forests to use the wood to cook with, but there are other ways to do that, right? There's other ways that you can use resources in your environment to live in a way that is in harmony with nature. We talked a lot about the African worldview versus the European worldview. The African worldview is rooted in harmony with nature. It's rooted in harmony with the land. And as we educate our children, it's important that we're educating them from that worldview so that they can reestablish their relationship with the land. So I'm going to go over a couple examples from our trip, as well as some examples that we're doing here in Tallahassee to help reestablish that connection with our students and with our children to the land. The first is going to be from Sierra Leone. So in talking about education and how that relates to reshaping our relationship with the land. The deforestation issue, they're cutting down trees to make coal, to make firewood, and to cook with. There are more regenerative methods that could be used to cook with, right? And one issue that we talked about, or one potential solution, is using bamboo. Bamboo grows extremely fast, it's extremely durable, you can build with it, you can cook with it, and you can regenerate the plant over and over and over again. It grows very well, both in Tallahassee, it grows well everywhere, all over the world. It's an amazing plant, but it's underused, right? So as we are teaching building and carpentry and agriculture and cooking to our youth, reshaping or rethinking what are the materials that we're using to do that, or encouraging them to use bamboo and replace the firewood so that we can preserve our trees and preserve our environment. And really rethinking what it means to have an advanced society. So in this past summer, we did a summer camp here at FL A&M University, where we worked with several youth in the community to re-educate them on what it means to be an African, to re-educate them on what it means to be Black, what it means to be a scholar, but also what does it mean to relate to the land. And we were able to see how changing our education process with our students impacted, just their entire outlook on the world, on themselves, and in nature. One beautiful example is we took, and these are all local Tallahassee kids, we took them over to a state park and they were able to swim in a lake and swim with turtles and be surrounded by trees and really had this beautiful Black joy in green spaces, right? But the conversation that went on with the students is a lot of them have never swum in a lake. Some of them were scared of turtles, or the idea of swimming with fish, right, blew their mind. Like, why would I get into a body of water that has little things swimming around and they're alive? I'm not getting in that. We had adults who were like, I'm a counselor, but I'm not getting in there. I don't do turtles. I don't do live water, right? But there's this accepted disconnect that we have with nature. Like, it's common and it's not questioned, and everybody is in agreement. Black people, we inside, we don't go outside, we don't swim, we don't hike, it's an accepted disconnect. But that's not natural to us. And while some adults may be stuck in their ways, right? I'm an educator, I'm a teacher by trade. I have so much potential and hope for the children that sometimes it's harder to reshape adults' minds than it is with children. So I'm a firm advocate that if we want to change the future, if we want to change our culture, we need to start with the little ones because they're very open and adaptable. So after a conversation, they were open to going in the water. They were open to learning how to swim. We taught little Black babies how to float for the first time. Kids who were terrified of water before. We went on hikes and taught them how to track animals and how to, what do you do when you see a bear in the wild? How do you hike? How do you react to snakes? Like eliminating some of this fear that because of colonization, that we've developed with nature, this conflict that we have with nature. It's extremely important that as the students who are in here, you know, as you grow up and start your own families, or the educators that are in here, as you talk to your students, that we reestablish that African relationship with the land, and we start to rethink and reshape how we teach our children so that they can have an authentic relationship with the land. Once that relationship is established, some of these issues that we've talked about, some of this objectification of water and land and trees and animals, the quickness to cut down or destroy or control, some of those mentalities that are wrapped into this European worldview, those will go away, right? They'll be replaced with the African worldview, but it starts with our relationship with the land. And it's extremely important as we are raising this next generation that we're almost checking our own biases and our own worldview so that we're not repeating. We've talked a lot about repeating these toxic cycles of European relatedness, right? Either, you know, how we think, how we organize. It's extremely important that we check ourselves when we're talking to children. Like, even when adults joke about swimming, like, it was funny this summer, you know, the adults were like, I'm not getting in that water, ha ha ha, but the kids are listening to y'all. You know, like, they're picking up on that. Like, my mama don't swim, I'm not, if my hair gonna get messed up, her hair gonna get messed up, I'm not jumping in that water. You know, they're listening to us, they're mimicking us. And it's important that as the carriers of culture for the next generation, that we're able to check ourselves so that we can ensure that our planet, that the land is protected, because they will be the keepers of the land. And it's our responsibility to instill that responsibility in them, to instill that connection into them. So just really thinking how we educate our youth. In addition to that, rethinking what environmental education is. Here in the United States, I think environmental education is very segregated from education in general, right? When you learn about the environment in K through 12, you're learning about, I don't know, what are you learning about? Yeah, like bodies of water, tectonic plates, you know, the weather system, you know, but you're not learning that the land has a spirit. Right? We're learning that a land is an object. It can be controlled, it can be bought, it can be sold, it can be, how do you manage crops? And, you know, in traditional agriculture, you learn a lot. How do you control the pests in your garden? How do you control or rid yourself of this nuisance so that you can grow 1,000 acres of corn or 1,000 acres of cotton, which is what we talked about. How do we, you know, don't worry about depleting the soil or the insects that are in the soil or the microorganisms that are in the soil. We just want to grow 1,000 acres of cotton so we can make money, right? That's problematic because the planet is going to be destroyed. Right. So as we are educating our children, it's important that we're teaching that when you plant something, there's a spirit in the ground. There are animals in that ground. When you plant a plant, you're planting a live species into living soil that is filled with millions of organisms that all have a purpose. And as you are planting that plant, you have a purpose as well, right? You have a responsibility as well to make sure that the plant that you are, the life that you are putting in the ground, you're cultivating it so it can then give more life. And you're a keeper of life as you're interacting with the soil and as we're interacting with the land. And all of this, to talk about the work that the FAMU Lola Hampton Frank Penner Center of Agroecology is doing, that is one of our missions, is to help reestablish the youth's relationship with the land. So we've been working with the preschool here on campus as well as FAMU DRS to do some of that stuff. And we have the babies outside all day, working in the soil. We're reading books, we're reading outside. We're reestablishing how they interpret education, how they deal with nature, how they interact with nature so that it's a normal thing. It shouldn't be, you know, even us sitting, it's a beautiful day outside. We might need a jacket, but sitting, you know, inside learning is one thing, but using nature to teach you, allowing nature to teach you is something completely different. So as we move forward, I'm an advocate for education. I just want everybody to be conscious of the unconscious and the conscious comments that we talk about when we talk about nature, when we talk about the environment, and then our actions as well, because actions are always going to speak louder than words. And it could be something simple as, oh, it's raining, and you run inside. It was this really beautiful moment in Sierra Leone. We went out one Sunday morning, and we just went out for a walk. I think we were looking for food. We were hungry. And it started raining. Now, if you're in Florida and it starts raining, what does everybody do?
Go inside.
You run inside, you run for shelter. Nobody flinched when it started raining. Everybody just kept right on walking. We walked past the ocean, and it was whole communities, fully clothed, jumping waves in the ocean together, just having a good time. It was beautiful, right? That there's, the culture, it wasn't eroded, despite, colonialism and despite the colonization that went on. Like their core values, like their core understanding of how you react to nature. It's not something they're in conflict with. They loved being outside. Everybody was outside. You cook outside. You go for walks outside. Like they just have a divine connection and understanding of what it means to be in nature, and it affects your entire being. Your psychological, your physical, your mental. Like it impacts you on so many levels. But that hasn't left. Certain spaces of the continent, certain spaces of the Caribbean, and even certain spaces here. It hasn't left us. We just have to continue to go back to it and be very intentional when we're teaching our children that is the norm, right? We start outside, and then everything else comes from that. Everything comes from the land and comes from nature. So in line with education, in African-centered education, it's an exchange, right? So we don't want to stand up here and talk to you. We want it to be an exchange of knowledge. So I'm going to bring Dr. Densu back up, and he is going to take some questions from the audience. And when I say he, I mean we, because we are a we people. So are there any questions for any of the panelists up here regarding culture, organization, politics, land, or anything remotely or unremotely connected?